All right, so to the screen share. Perfect. Here. All right, perfect. So just hello, everybody. And I would just like to get things underway. Just a friendly reminder to please keep your mics on mute and your camera turned off. We would ask that you reserve all of your questions until the end of the conversation, just because we don't want to interrupt the flow of this evening's events. We do look forward to any questions you might have, though. We are recording tonight's talk. We'll be posting this on the Estevan Art Gallery and Museum's YouTube page. If you have any questions, please post it at the end. And if you don't want to switch your camera on to ask a question, please feel free to post it in the chat, and Carly, my Programming Education Outreach Coordinator, will ask it for you. So thank you for joining us this evening for the inaugural Curated Conversations, where we'll be featuring brief artist talks from the They Didn't Know We Were Seeds artist Carol Wylie, and In the World But Not of It artist Tim Smith. And then afterwards, we're going to launch into Curated Answer and Question session, which will be mediated by myself, Amber Andersen, and I am the Director Curator of the Estevan Art Gallery Museum. And this is an opportunity, I think, for all of us to gain particular insight into these very timely and significant exhibitions. So I'm going to go switch right to here. So a thank you to our funders. Funders of our gallery make events such as this possible. And so I'd actually like to acknowledge the support of Sask Arts, City of Estevan, Government of Saskatchewan, Tourism Saskatchewan, Sask Culture, Sask Lotteries, Canadian Heritage, and Affinity Credit Union. And I'd also like just to take a moment to acknowledge the behind the scenes support of my staff and board of directors, whose commitment to this institution is invaluable. And I think most of us kind of realize that, right? So I also then want to get into the land acknowledgement here. So as I'm sitting in the exhibition that is Carol Wylie's, and Carly is actually in Tim Smith's currently, I thought, it's very apropos that we think about the land that we inhabit as settlers throughout all of Canada. So the Estevan Art Gallery Museum respectfully acknowledges that we are part of the Treaty 2 territory, which is a traditional gathering place of the Nakota, Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota. And we are also on Treaty 4 territory, which is the traditional gathering place for the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And the artists presenting this evening reside on Treaty 2 territory and also Treaty 6 territory, with Treaty 6 being the traditional grounds and gathering place of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. We acknowledge all the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of Canada and the footsteps that have marked these lands for centuries. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories, and we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. And we are committed to move forward in partnership with the Indigenous nation in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration, which is really significant considering what we are discussing tonight. So I'm going to just do a brief introduction here to Carol Wylie, and then we're going to listen to her talk, and I'm very excited to hear this. So I do want to acknowledge that all the images shown in the slide tonight are copyrighted by the artists, and their written permission is requested for any other use in any other circumstance. Carol has engaged in an active art practice for 30 years. Exclusively working with portrait and figuration, she holds an MFA from the Vermont College of Fine Arts, and a BFA in studio art, and a BA in psychology from the University of Saskatchewan. She resides in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and divides her time between personal practice, teaching drawing, and painting for Hughes Art Supply, and art education at the Ramey Modern Art Gallery of Saskatchewan. So thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Amber. So I can tell you a little bit about this show and what kind of instigated it. When I always have gone to the Holocaust Memorial Services that are held in Saskatoon annually. And the last time that I went, or when I went in 2016, for some reason it hit me for the first time how these survivors are aging, and how this firsthand account that is the best sort of way to to battle deniers, Holocaust deniers, with his firsthand stories and experiences, is going to be lost to us probably within a decade or a little more. And so I thought I really wanted to preserve them in some way. And as a portrait artist, it's really kind of where I can make my contribution. It's what I do. It's what I love. It's the most sort of direct form of communication for me. So that's where I started. And then over the next little while, just by happenstance, there were a few events that happened that connected the Indigenous community and the experience of residential school survivors to my community. I went to a community Passover Seder. We have a very progressive rabbi who made sure to always acknowledge another group during the Seder. And in this particular time, it was residential school survivors he was acknowledging and having us think about that. I had taken some Indigenous sensitivity training through my workplace and found out that the original, that they called the residential schools originally the final solution, which shocked me because that was exactly the expression that Hitler used about the concentration camps and the Jews. So these connections started to happen for me. And I thought the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had just been published. I was kind of looking at all the different calls to action and thought, this could be a small step that I can take within those calls to action to bring residential school survivors into this project. Now, it's not without its level of fraughtness, because there's a very sort of destructive and negative history of non-Indigenous artists and photographers using Indigenous peoples as their subjects. And so I really thought long and hard about this. I knew probably I was going to get some backlash about it, but I went to every bit of effort I could to make sure there was no exploitation involved. All of the participants knew exactly what the project was going to be all about. Every time I get an artist fee for this work, I share it with all of the participants. I've worked at every level to make sure that because to me it was more important to include residential schools survivors and sort of raise the gravitas of that. And that was before, the recent news of the finding of the graves, to sort of really understand how hard hitting that history is and how much it's been denied in Canadian culture for so long, that holding up against the Holocaust, I don't think is at all an unreasonable relationship. And to me, it's sort of on a macro level, the powers of oppression use the same kind of tactics. And those tactics were used on the Jews, and those tactics were used on the residential school children. And that's cutting off hair, and that's assigning numbers, and that's removing them from their families and destroying family units. All those things are the same. And then back down to the individual level, when you are the victim of that kind of abuse, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what the circumstances are, you're going to feel that pain the same way. And so those two connections on the macro and the micro level for me were really important in putting together this. And the byproduct of it was I met some amazing people, some very generous and incredible people, both in the Holocaust survivors and in the residential school survivors. And I learned, they schooled me real well in those kinds of experiences that they'd had that had been missing from my education. So, and a lot of the residential school survivors in particular are in my community. Unlike the Holocaust survivors, there's only one in my community. And so I have some new friends. I just feel really close to people I just had never knew before and never knew about their experiences before. And so that was the impetus for the project. It took me 3 years to meet up with everyone, to sit with them, to talk to them, to sketch them, and then to do the paintings. And the project has 18 paintings all together, because 18 is the number that represents the Hebrew word chai, which means life. So that was a little bit of hope I hope to bring to the project.
Wow. Thank you so much. I mean, that brings so much insight to the exhibition, and is a really great precursor for some of the questions that we're going to launch into here shortly. So then we will shift to the next one, which is Tim Smith. So I'll just introduce here Tim. Manitoba-based photographer Tim Smith has spent 14 years documenting life on the prairies, including 12 years photographing the Hutterites, insular Anabaptists that live communally on colonies in Canada and the United States. His work is among the broadest and most extensive visual documentation of their culture ever produced. In addition to a long-term documentary work, he covers assignments for a variety of editorial and commercial clients in the prairies and occasionally further afield. His work has been published in newspapers and magazines worldwide and exhibited in Canada, Europe, and the United States. Portions of his works from the prairies and the Portions of his works from the prairies and the Hutterites are part of the province of Manitoba's art collection. So, Tim, if I could get you to talk a little bit about your exhibition in the world, but not of it.
Sure, thank you very much. Just for a bit of background, so I come to this from a photography and journalism background, and I didn't really have, or I don't have, an art background whatsoever. I got into journalism and photography and primarily do work for editorial clients, newspapers, magazines, and sort of wanted to get into documentary photography and have done a few different projects, but this one is by far the most extensive and the longest. And it kind of came up, it came along kind of by accident. I had been looking for a project. I was out cruising the back roads of southwestern Manitoba, looking for photos for the local newspaper, and I stumbled upon Dearborn and Hutterite colony. And it was spring, the women were out in the garden seeding, and I pulled over and started talking to them, asking if I can take some pictures. At the time, I really knew nothing about Hutterite culture. I had a few, I guess, preconceived ideas, but really knew nothing in depth about their culture. The women happily agreed, said that it was fine for me to take some photos while they were planting. And while I was taking their photos, this was in 2009, one of the young women pulled a flip phone out of the pocket of her dress and took a couple photos of me making photos. And that was the first kind of shock to me, because I really knew nothing about their connections to technology. And it really made me realize that I knew nothing about this culture, but I wanted to learn more about it. So I went back and I spoke to the minister, and we went back and forth quite a few times. And I just kept going back. And I was lucky that I was allowed to come back and to just kind of build relationships and get to know people. At the time, I thought maybe this would be a 6-month or 1-year-long project. I never expected to still be doing this 12 years later. But number one, that kind of shows how little I knew about the culture and getting involved in it. And basically, I devoured everything I could find about Hutterite culture, every book, every kind of university paper that had been published. I really went as in depth as I could to learn, and the more that I did learn, the more I knew I needed to devote more time to this. I was very cognizant of not wanting to create a one-dimensional portrayal of their society. I really wanted this to be as broad and to show the complexity of the of colony life as broadly and as complexly as possible. So that really came down to just spending a lot of time building relationships, starting with Dearborn Colony and then expanding to over 24 colonies, primarily in Manitoba. I've photographed a couple in Saskatchewan, but so far the project focuses primarily on the Schmiedelite colonies in Manitoba. At the time, I had planned to have this published editorially in newspapers, magazines. It was just kind of by chance that I stumbled, I guess, into the art world and being able to exhibit when the curator of the art gallery here in Brandon offered me an exposition. and that was kind of my first introduction into being able to showcase the work in this kind of venue. In terms of the work that's on display at the Estevan Art Gallery, it all stems from my 12-year project. And a lot of the work focuses on the youth in the colony and the dichotomy between teenagers and the youth finding their own individuality while fitting into what is a conformist system and a communal life. And beyond that, the work really just tries to capture daily life as I see it unfold in front of me. I really try to take no stance in terms of, I'm not trying to showcase how to write life as perfect, nor am I trying to showcase it in a way that is othering or romanticizing or denigrating. At the end of the day, I want the people that see my work more to focus on connections that they see to their own lives rather than, you know, the simplistic differences that you see on the surface, I guess, in the individuals.
Wow, perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm just so very happy to actually have both of you here with us this evening. And we are going to kind of go into now what is a selection of questions that basically I have curated based on both of the exhibitions. But first I thought maybe I'd kind of explain the process of me being in there as a curator. So how do these shows come together? So I have this up here, so I'll kind of paraphrase a little bit, but at the Estevan Art Gallery Museum, we have two different spaces. They're separated by walls, doors, structures. They're two different spaces completely. But I like to curate them, keeping in mind that I feel that they can be structurally stronger when they explore subject matter that is similar, whether that is actually the physical medium itself, or a conceptual investigation, or just a practice that's kind of similar. I mean, or perhaps even a diversity. So on the surface level, just walking in, I'm sure that people are like, oh, these are together because they're portraiture, they're portraits. But I think if you investigate further and do your research, like such as listening to these artists today or looking into their writing on their own practices, you'll see that they're using portraiture as a means to investigate and portray communities so that we can garner a better understanding of the communities that we live in, the land that we inhabit, and the people that we consider our neighbors and friends. I'm originally from Southwestern Manitoba, so I grew up in communities that were heavily Hutterite and Mennonite. And obviously being in the prairies itself, the history of not knowing what really happened in the Indigenous, like to the Indigenous people in the residential schools, it was something that wasn't even taught to me at all. So in thinking about these circumstances, I thought that they kind of echoed a similar sentiment, which is, I think, I have it kind of written out here, but every person has a story. And as a cliche goes, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So to have these portraits around us, I meant it as a way to encourage our views on these different histories, on these different peoples. Although, some are more historical than others, they're both things that are very contemporary. So with both exhibitions, there's a foot in the past, there's a foot in the present, and then there's a foot in the future as well. And I thought that this would be a great way to question viewers' assumptions about what they know about these people. And so the people who have done the work into this research are the artists. And so Carol and Tim, we as a cultural community and then we as a society can't thank you enough for presenting these work and making these works so that we can challenge perceptions. And I think with any story, even beyond 1,000 words, I think we need to have conversation. And I think that this is a roadway to genuinely creating a more compassionate society. So I think having these two exhibitions together, you know, surface all portraits, but I think there's so much more invested that, you know, obviously has come through in the two talks that you just gave. So that was kind of my thought process on putting you guys together. So I thought I will just jump right into here. So I call this process an introductions because something that I was really keenly interested about is both of these, obviously you're dealing with particular sitters, particular subjects. So I guess my first question is, how did you select, I mean, and Tim, you probably all maybe talked about this a little bit, but how did you select these subjects? Like how did this come about? Like how do you even begin a project? And I guess I'll just flip to you, Carol, first, and then I'll flip to Tim for his reply next.
Sure. For me, I kind of was just working with whoever I could find. It was the concept I had come up with first, after having seen Nate Leipziger was the speaker, and he's actually not part of the series, but who kind of planted the seed of the idea in me to at least start looking at some kind of record through what I do of Holocaust survivors. And then essentially that was tricky for me because I live in Saskatoon and I only know one Holocaust survivor here. And that's, I think, all there is in Saskatoon. So my brother lives in Toronto and I was going to visit him and he's quite connected to the Jewish community there. So he actually arranged for me to meet quite a few of Holocaust survivors that live in Toronto while I was there. And so it was sort of a matter of people connecting me with people, and that happened with the residential school survivors as well, that we would have open, I share a studio space with 10 other artists, and we have open studios. People would visit the space. I would tell them about the project, and they would say, oh, I know this such and such person. They went to residential school. I can probably ask if they'd be interested in talking to you. And that's the way it kind of went. Just this person connected me with this person and connected me with that person. And so less than, it wasn't so much me seeking them out as the networking of the community that brought them together for me.
And Tim?
Yeah, my experience is very similar to Carol's in a lot of ways. When I started at Dearborn Colony, it was really just about getting to know the community, getting to know who was comfortable with me and my camera and who wasn't, and just spending time with the people who were, and just waiting for moments to unfold. Taking a lot of photos that ended up on the cutting room floor that just weren't very good or won't be seen. Spending even more time not taking photos and just talking, listening, trying to become a bit a part of daily life, taking part in activities there, whether it be enjoying their field day picnic or helping to butcher chickens, things like that. Just helped me get to know the community, and more importantly, helped the community get to know me, because those relationships are so important, and they are continual. Everything is a continual conversation. And then from there, as I started to, I guess, broaden from Dearborn Colony, a lot of it was, like Carol was saying, someone that you're talking to, mentions an event that's happening or a person that might be interesting to photograph, and you kind of work your way on from there. And it became easier to find out about events or situations or individuals who I thought would be important to my project that I would want to photograph. And so it snowballs in a way. It is still every new community I go into, or every individual or family that I meet, you kind of start the process over again of building that trust, building the relationships, and that. But then you also tend to have people to vouch for you, which is helpful. And so it kind of snowballs in a way, and sometimes you get no's, sometimes things don't work out. But I've been fortunate that so many people have taken the time to allow me into their lives. And I treat that really respectfully. And I think I'm very grateful for it.
So it's very much about relationship building is what it all really comes down to, relationship, and not just with an individual, but with an entire community, because there's a certain amount of trust in relaying that story. And so that kind of is, I'm gonna, I wrote these artist questions, and then I'm gonna skip ahead to some of them. But one of the questions I wrote them was, so where does their story end and yours begin? So what I mean by this is in regards to specifically thinking about that process switch from documentation to an artistic product. So where you have the license in regards to your artistic representation of your subjects. And then, in brackets, I'm like, or does it, or is it a total part of the process involving the above question about relationship building? So I'm very intrigued by that. So I guess I'll start with Tim, and then we'll switch to Carol this time.
So if I understand the question correctly, in terms of how I display the work, and how I use the work in that, especially as this project has gone on. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, in thinking of like especially when you're processing the work and you're getting ready for exhibition, which I mean is a little bit of a different process, because that's not necessarily your initial thinking of it, but this idea of the trust and the rapport to work with them and document, but then for you to still have the decision of like, this was the image, this was the crop, this was the cut, this is how I want to represent that moment and that artistic
Absolutely.
license.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, I'm the one going through all the work and deciding what image may work in which context and that. But I believe that all of my work is a continual conversation with the people that I consider friends now on these communities, and I want my work to be absolutely approachable. So that if the people in the work, in any of the photos have any concerns about them, and that dialogue is always there. It's important to me, especially as this has gone on. I am a lot more cognizant, I guess, of any individual or community concerns of the work, and I want the individuals in the work to be comfortable with the representation and with how the work is exhibited. So I absolutely have conversations when sometimes I know just based on the individuals or the community or the type of image that it is, I already know if it's going to be fine, and that if I have any concerns or if I'm just not sure, then I like to make it clear with the individuals and just get their blessing and make sure that they're okay with it. And I like to be open and honest from the beginning about what I intend to do with the work.
So very conversational. Yeah.
Absolutely, and continual.
Right. And Carol, what about you?
It's probably similar and yet very different in some ways, being a painting practice as opposed to photographic practice. But I am and I know that you're probably going to want to talk about this later, but the core of my interest in portraiture comes from a real interest in how people interact with each other and with the world, and how they change each other, not just emotionally, but actually physiologically and neurologically. From these interactions. And so each of the sitters, with the exception of one, and I'll speak to him in a minute, I spend time with. We talk about their experience, or we don't talk about their experience. Some people didn't want to talk about their experience. We just chatted about their life, and I sketch. And I'm a firm believer that our experience and who we are is visible on our face, in the nuances of our face. And that sometimes we can put up a sort of a facade for a while. But if you're sitting and chatting with me sitting 3 feet away from you, sketching, that's not going to stay up there for very long. So I work from photographs after the fact, just because they can't sit for me endlessly. I can't have them in to sit for me endlessly. It's the only way that I can have the information I need to get the preciseness that I need for resemblance, which is very important to me. So after I've sketched and we've had our conversation and the hours have gone by and I get the photographs that I think are truly bare photographs that expose who they really are, then I go into this long process that's very primal of my body being the receiver for that information and for that memory of that interaction, into my body becoming the tool that then records all of that. And so it's very unconscious. I'm not thinking I want to put pathos in here. I want to put, sympathy in here. I'm just painting what I see and the nuances of what I see in the face. And essentially it's coming through the tool of my body and becoming what it becomes, a portrait. And I feel that if I do have that resemblance and I do have all those nuances, the way I saw them and the way I felt them and the way I experienced them as I was painting them, that the person will inhabit the canvas. And it's the years of doing it that have taken me to a place where I can now trust that process. And it really does happen for me. That experience does transmit to the canvas, and those nuances do create that individual.
Oh, well, thank you. Let's switch on to here. So I've titled each section, so it's kind of sectional, and I'm glad that we're kind of, even though these are very curated, you had the conversation with me in regards to the questions ahead of time, but I'm glad that these observations are all kind of coming together. And so this section, I call relationship time and observations, and that's from me because I, unlike the public who just kind of walks in and has a certain amount of time with it, I live with these works, working, 40 hours a week, and the shows are up for like 8 weeks. You get to really have an intimacy with that work that is probably only maybe reserved for the artists themselves, to spend that volume of time with it. So I thought I would start off this section, and just because these are kind of directed directly to Tim. So you've worked on this particular project for quite some time, and you're working with sitters that would have been children or teens. Some may have passed, given birth, left the community. There's a passage of time in your photos. There's something both readily apparent and seemingly aloof. And that's kind of mixed in with the tradition of the dress and just the activities that they're doing. And then there's just this notion that you have sitters that you can see age if you read all the different right labels. So how have your relationships changed with participants over time, and has your relationship to the project overall changed with time?
Yeah, I think it absolutely has changed. The relationships have grown stronger. A lot of these people are great friends. They're almost family. But I am so invested in the lives of the people that I photograph. I care deeply about them and about their celebrations and their struggles and what they go through. And in some ways, I wonder. I think that makes me a better photographer. I hope. I think also in some ways it makes me a worse documentarian, because I'm more hesitant to take a picture in some situations. I'm constantly self-assessing and assessing if I'm doing the right thing and things like that. And at the end of the day, the relationships are more important than the work. And being responsive to how they want to be seen is very important to me. Again, I want to show the work honestly. I don't shy away from anything on the colony. I want to photograph life as I see it, and sometimes it's pretty, and sometimes it's sad, and sometimes it's hard, and sometimes it's beautiful and so amazing. And I do try to show all of that, but I am definitely cognizant of the these aren't just subjects in my photos. These these are friends. These are amazing, complex individuals, and I want that to come through in my work. And in terms of what you mentioned about time, and that time really is the secret ingredient to my work in so many ways, and I really couldn't have known that starting this work. But I mean, in so many, number one, I'm not a great photographer. I keep going back to it. This work, better photographers could have done this in maybe a quarter of the time, but I have the luxury that I can keep going back, and I keep going back, and that makes the work stronger. And also that ingredient of time, like you mentioned, just adds so much more dimension to the work, because like you said, I have children that are now adults that have children of their own, individuals like the woman in the photo there, Ruth, who unfortunately have passed on. So it becomes more of a historical record in a way of this period of time in Manitoba Hutterite society, and that's something that you couldn't replicate without putting in the time. There's no way to kind of fake that secret ingredient.
I think you can readily see it in the work, absolutely. And then my next question is, it could be happenstance, as you have a significant volume of work, which which you have brought up, and I have seen like the portfolios. But what I noticed is that a lot of the subjects in this particular exhibition were women. And was this like a incidental in regards to what was in that, maybe that particular portfolio? Or have you found that female sitters were more willing to participate in the project? And then, so that's one section of the question. And I said, there's a particular image that I really was struck by. And it's this image here of a woman showing a henna tattoo. And this is something that I know would be greatly frowned upon in Hutterite cultural communities. So it really struck me that there's a level of risk taking and trust, much like between Carol and her sitters, that is so apparent with the work. So what observations have you had working on this project? So just to kind of reiterate, working with the female sitters, is that something that you've found more of? And what have your observations been working on this project, especially for as long as you have worked on it?
Sure. So in terms of the images I have of women on the colony, and that it wasn't deliberate, it is incidental, but there are a few reasons for it. Number one, so much of the women's work on the colony is truly communal, in terms of they work in the garden together, they work in the kitchen together, they do the canning together, they sew together. Whereas a lot of the men's work, I would say, is split between communal and individual, whereas you might have a couple individuals that work in the pig barn, a couple that work in the dairy barn, a carpenter here, a plumber there, a couple people that work on the farm, but they may work separately. Some communities where they have manufacturing, then it would be more communal because you have a bigger group working together and that. And early on in the project, I found it was easier to negotiate access into these communal groups that were more comfortable with me being around when they were in the groups. So it was easy to gravitate to some of the women's work in that on the colony, and then through that build relationships with the individuals in it. And then secondly, I think because how to write colonies have very defined gender roles on the colony, and women don't hold any of the positions of power on the colony in terms of decision making and voting on the colony for the most part. Although many of the wives will argue that their husbands will make decisions based on what their wives think is best, and that. But because they don't hold positions of power, I also find that they are what's the right word? They are so free in terms of how open they are and how they speak and how comfortable with they are with kind of telling things as it is, and that because they're not burdened by I guess upsetting the balance or losing any power, if that makes sense. So I've always found the women on the colony to be the most open and the most free and outgoing. And that's not to say that the men aren't, because I know plenty of men on the colonies that are very open and outgoing as well. But I do think there's an extra element of camaraderie and openness amongst the women. And then in terms, sorry, go ahead.
No, that really comes through in the work. And I knew that was probably more complex than just, like, oh, the focus was on women. But I mean, those are really engaging and interesting points that you bring up, because there is a certain in the photographs that I'm thinking of in the exhibition with the women in particular, where there's such a sense of freedom and defining these roles that we would be more assumptive of it being traditional. And you see a lot of women in this exhibition who are kind of breaking with our perceived notions of what that traditional community would look like.
Absolutely, and I hope a lot of my work, regardless of gender, kind of shows that the breaking with our expectations. But yeah, absolutely, with some of the work of the women, like you mentioned, this photo here of the woman with the henna tattoo. Now that is frowned upon, like you said, in the communities, personal adornments like that. In terms of how big a deal it is, it would depend. Every colony kind of handles things like that different in that, but it's not something that the individual would necessarily go around advertising that they did, even though it's just a temporary tattoo adornment, which is why I chose not to identify the individual or the colony where it was taken. But it does trigger responses. I've even since this exhibition has been up, I had one individual, I believe from the Saskatchewan or Alberta colony, message me saying, why would I show a picture like this? Because this isn't what How to Write Life is about. And that, but my argument is that I'm here to show how to write life as it is, not as an ideal, as it is, as it should be, or how, as it strives to be, or how the individual strives to be. I'm just here to show the individuals as they are, and this was a moment, a portrait of an individual as she is, and she was comfortable with the image being published. So I feel like I did my homework in that regard, and I'm showing something that the individual is comfortable with, and that shows aspects of how to write life that you may not expect to see.
No, you can definitely see that in the work, and thank you so much. I think that really gives some backing to some of my observations that just come naturally from looking at the work. So the next person in the hot seat, so to speak, Carol. So just some observations with your exhibition. So obviously anyone who enters into this exhibition space can feel the emotions of your sitters. You're so good at conveying through the eyes, through the face, just the gestures that you're able to articulate. Anyone with eyes can see this in this work. It's so readily apparent. And my question though was, how were you able to cope through this project? Because it's immediately tied to your familial heritage as a Jewish person. So, you know, we often think of the sitter, but you as the artist internalizing, hearing all of this and processing, what was that like for you?
Yeah, it was interesting. I would generally do one of these portraits, and I wanted to do them large scale, so they took a little bit longer, and but I wanted them to be uh, something you couldn't ignore, something that was going to be fill up your field of vision, and you were going to be able to turn away without seeing them. And so they took a little bit longer to do. And I did find that quite often, before I entered into the process of starting the next portrait, I had to do something unrelated. I had to do something that was completely different. And so I would do a small piece or whatever. I have several models that I work with frequently just to practice with the figure, and or I have family members, I have grandchildren, so I'd paint my grandchildren, like just something that was completely removed from the project. And then when I felt ready again, I would dive into the next one. So yeah, it could be quite emotional, all right. But again, the process is so unconscious and so primal that I'm not sort of thinking all those things while I'm working. I'm really just observing really carefully, and again, the memory of the interaction with this person is there, and the memory of maybe whatever research or whatever they said or whatever I've read or is all kind of there in the background, but it's not in my consciousness. So yeah, I'm very much like a worker bee as I'm working away painting, just basically doing the process and doing the craft with my hand. And then it's after the fact that I step back and go, oh God, there she is. And then there's that experience, there's that feeling. And then I would step away and do something else till the next one.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Because this is really coming from, you are part of the community in this sense, right? So that was something else that I want to talk about. So when I first had booked the exhibition, was looking at them, you see these black backgrounds, and you just obviously focus on the sitter, on the portrait itself. And it wasn't until I actually was hanging them in the gallery space. And so at first glance, it can be easily missed. I mean, even if I'm 10 feet from your paintings currently and I can't see it, but when you get up close to the images, you'll notice in the background that there's phrases or parts of their stories included in the background of the paintings, which really creates another level of emotive tie to the subjects and then also to the viewers reading it. So I wanted to speak to you because it's something I think you have talked about in the past, but can you speak to the inclusion of the different words and the different phrases, and what has been the reaction of your sitters, their friends or family or anyone, to this project over time?
Yeah, they over the course of the time that we would talk and I would sketch, I would sort of writing down random things that they said that just I thought were quite poignant or that really resonated with me. And I thought afterwards, I didn't want them to get in the way of experiencing that moment with that sitter, with that subject, because that to me was the important thing, was connecting with the individual and connecting with the individual's experience through their eyes and through what their face was telling you. But then I thought these words were too strong and too resonant to not have people see that too. To again, as you say, to be a deeper level to experience this moment with this individual. So it's kind of like two layers of experiences. And for the most part, family and friends have really really liked the portraits and liked the fact that there's sort of an immortality, I guess, that comes for their relative, in that this portrait will live long beyond them, and it's going to be seen by a lot of people and bring up the fact that their relative or themselves have been through this experience. and to maybe build a little bit of compassion by understanding that connection of the viewer to the subject as being an individual on an equal level and living sort of in the same realm. That building of compassion, I think, often comes from the experience of truly understanding and empathizing with another individual's experience versus listening to numbers like 6 million or 150,000 or whatever the statistics tell you. They can be so abstract that they really, they may resonate intellectually, but they don't necessarily resonate with you emotionally. And it's those emotional memories that really stay with you and I think lead to learning and lead to compassion. So that's what that one-on-one and the reading of a little bit of quotations was all about, was to create that experience of a viewer to one individual subject.
I think it's been really interesting because, like I said, it's really quite obvious in the photo that I have of it on the screen here, but it actually is quite easy to and depending on your level of sight. Right. But it's been really, I think it is an investment for people to, they maybe want to know more about these stories, more about that history. So but I also do agree with the effect of it not necessarily being front and center, because like just looking at the person and seeing them as who they are as survivors, right, is really striking when you walk into the exhibition.
I will just tell a little story too that about Eugene Arcane, which was an image you had up earlier, that he doesn't have any text in his, but what he does have is something that looks kind of like a blurry lighted area. And he walked into my studio to meet with me the first time. And he's a powerful personality. He's well over 6 feet tall, and he's a real character. And but he walked in and he said to me, I do want to be part of this project, and I do want you to paint me, but you need to paint my classmates too. And he pulled out this folded up piece of paper with a photograph of his class at residential school, and they were probably about 10 years old. And so he left that was a copy. He has several copies of this that he carries with him at all times. He is never without a photograph of these fellow students. And so that little bit of white spot there is that photograph collaged into the background of Eugene's piece. So they will be with him in this painting for as long as it lasts as well.
That is, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it's one of the few things that doesn't have, yeah. And I was wondering what that is. So thank you so much for including that, because that actually resonates. That's kind of an inside scoop. And I mean, it makes it resonate even that much more. Here we go. I'm just pressing buttons. It's that time of the night. So obviously we had kind of going into that past, present, future, and now, you know, we kind of talked a bit about that, but I'm thinking of past and present as a starting point, and this is kind of a question to you both, and then the next section is kind of about the future. And so my statement question, which they all seem to be statement questions, is there's a timeliness and a timelessness to both of these exhibitions. They capture people at a specific time in their lives, or reflecting on a particular time, and both feature topics that have been in the news most recently. So most recently, there have been heartbreaking and sickening number of mass unmarked graves found at residential schools. And as we move towards truth and reconciliation, we have much work to do in regards to reconciling with a history that has mostly been whitewashed. And recently, during the pandemic, there was a vilification of hard-right communities in regards to their views on vaccination and perhaps potentially following health guidelines. So these are two communities that have been coming up in the news. So this is something that we can easily understand and would be viewed differently from colony to colony, but what I feel is both exhibitions have their feet firmly planted in the past, present, and future. And what is something, having explored these topics with rigor, both of you, and compassion, that you would like audiences to take away from the experience? And yeah, all right, I guess I had to pick one of you. Tim, if you want to go.
Sure, no problem. In terms of what I want audiences and viewers of the work to take away from it, is that these are complex communities, just as complex as any other community in the world, and the community that the viewers live in. No two colonies are the same. We as humans, we have a tendency to reduce things to their simplest form. And there is benefit to that, but there's a lot of harm that can come from that too, especially when viewing communities. And the Hutterites tend to get portrayed often in simplistic and kind of reductionist tropes. This idea that they're quaint, they're kind of backwards, even they're kind of romanticized as the simple life that they have, and regardless of whether they're kind of being denigrated or romanticized, either portrayal isn't accurate and does harm to the community. There's so much complexity in terms of the economies on the colonies and how colonies exist, in terms of social and political views on the colonies, in terms of what isn't allowed, and use of technology, cohesion from colony to colony. There is such a breadth of difference, and I think it's important for viewers to realize that and to move away from simplistic stereotypes or ideas of colony life. In terms of, like you brought up with the pandemic, there was in Manitoba in particular, at the beginning of the pandemic, around this time last year, a little bit earlier, Hutterite colonies were really badly affected by COVID outbreaks, a bit sooner than kind of the big cities in Manitoba. And there was stereotyping because of that. And it was unjust, it was unfair. And it was without context of a lot of the good that colonies were doing in terms of sewing masks, getting involved in manufacturing, 3D manufacturing of face shields, building hospital beds, and that for field hospitals in the United States, as well as being proactive. And again, with vaccination and that, there's no simplistic answer to vaccination or to protocol adherence amongst Hutterite colonies or amongst individuals on the colonies. It's just like everywhere else, where it is conversational, and there are Hutterites that are getting vaccinated and proudly sharing that in hopes of encouraging others. There are Hutterites that are distrustful of vaccination, or who don't believe that they need that because of a natural immunity through having had COVID. And then there's a million other kind of thoughts on the subject from individual to individual, and you really can't just say, oh, Hutterites are this or Hutterites are that. And I really hope that my work shows that there is no definitive view. And more importantly, my work is not the definitive view of Hutterite culture. My work, if anything, is hopefully just one of many openings to someone who wants to learn more about Hutterite life, and a stepping stone where they can move on to access other work to learn about that culture.
That's wonderful. Yes, thank you. Carol?
I mean, I hope that that the work will just help to, of course, this project was sort of ready and started touring before the revelations of the grave sites. And so I want people to go away from my exhibition acknowledging the history of a colonial effort to get rid of Indigenous ways of life, Indigenous practices, Indigenous culture, and Indigenous people. And we can't deny that. We cannot deny that that was what was happening. There were children and people dying because of the treatment they were receiving. And at best, the effort was to get rid of any kind of Indigenous languages, to get rid of any kind of Indigenous cultural practices, to get rid of any kind of Indigenous spiritual practices, truly to colonize. And I've always found that to be such a perverse thing to do, because what you want to do is you want to make them like the white colonizers, but you will never actually accept them as white colonizers. So you put them in an impossible situation. And so I want people to acknowledge that that history happened, and then to also connect with individuals and understand that how they would have felt if had it been then. We're all on this equal level, that we all feel the same kind of pain, that had it been them. For Eugene as an example, had you been feeling what Eugene had been feeling as a victim of sexual abuse in a residential school, how would you feel? And experience that in order to sort of build some compassion around other people's experiences. And I think beyond that, maybe become an individual who's going to try to build a bridge by supporting efforts for Indigenous people to get back to rebuild cultural practices, to get clean water on reservations or on reserves, to get languages back up and running, and people, lots more people fluent in Indigenous languages, to be active in sort of helping to heal that. Because I often think, and I spoke about this with Robbie Wiseman, who was one of the Holocaust survivors, that one of the ways that there's sort of two ways that Holocaust survivors went after the Holocaust was over. They either said, I am no longer going to be Jewish. I don't ever want this to happen to me or my family again. And I completely deny my Jewishness. And then the family from then on were no longer Jewish. Or they made sure that their kids went through the religious upbringing, even if it's a secular family. The boys would still have bar mitzvahs, the girls would still have bat mitzvahs. They still practice Passover once a year, still go through Yom Kippur every year. My family was a very secular family, but we still practiced all of those things to keep the Jewish culture alive. And that's why it survived beyond the Holocaust. And I think that that's what residential school survivors have to learn from Holocaust survivors, is that they're on the right path in finding their way back to their original language, back to their Indigenous spiritual practices, back to that worldview that was ripped away from them. Because it's like pulling a plant up by the roots you cut it off from its roots. How do you expect it to flourish? It won't flourish. Those roots have to be in place for that plant to flourish. And so I think I'm hoping that anybody that experiences this work and these people feels that they have a responsibility to support all of that work towards true reconciliation, and to make space for those voices, and to understand that the colonial way is not the right way. The European way is not the right way, that we need to learn what we have to learn from Indigenous practices. We have, especially with climate change the way it is, we have things to learn from Indigenous practices, and we need to understand that the wisdom does not stop with the European way of life. So that's way heavier than I wanted to get, but that's essentially the whole kind of sense of it. All this thing is part of this one sense of understanding what happened in our colonial history, and what we can do to start the reconciliation process.
Well, I think with both exhibitions, like there's just so much to learn, I think, and stepping outside of just the most basic understanding you have of a collective, and to push it further. I think it makes everyone a better person. A better person is a better society. Switching now, so we'll go to Carol. So future. So this is, I know I stole stuff from your guys' social media. So this is actually from Carol Wylie's website. That's her website right there. So Carol, obviously you've long been fascinated with capturing human portraits. And if you guys really want to see the wealth of Carol's work, please do visit her website. She has all of her series on there, and you can see that she's also very prolific in her practice as well. And so I'm just wondering, what has kept your fascination piqued with portraiture? Because it's a huge volume of it. And what is the allure of capturing portraits of people that has kept you invested in this exploration? And then as a final kind of third act of this question, could you speak to your current masked portrait project?
Yeah. I spoke a little earlier, and I'll just reiterate that that this fascination with portraiture really comes from relationships between people and how we affect each other in so many ways. And it's been a deep-seated thing. I mean, when I was a child, I was a drawer, and I never drew anything but people. All of my, like, I made paper dolls when I was 10. It was always about people. So there's something about that connection. I think it's because I'm fascinated with consciousness and the fact that our consciousness, because of our physical selves, our consciousness can never mix, right? We can only connect through the ways that we communicate and the ways that we impact each other through our interactions, but we can never actually experience the consciousness of another individual because of our physical bodies. And so I think that's where the fascination is for me, is wanting to know other people, knowing that I will never actually be able to experience the consciousness of another person. So how close can I get? And as close as I can get, I think, is by really, really studying the things about them that I think tell me who they are. And by understanding who they are, I understand who I am. Because I think it's almost like, it's not a mirror, but I know that there are many psychological, Jacques Lacan is one of the psychologists actually, who sort of spoke about how we use other people to define who we are, what we see in other people, what we can't see in ourselves, how other people are responding to us is how we learn about ourselves. So I think that there's a real strong connection between our interactions and understanding others and ourselves. So that's where the portrait fascination comes from. The mask series, when the pandemic hit, as I told you earlier, I share a studio space. Well, every other artist in my studio decided they weren't going to go to the studio. And I live in a really, really tiny house where there's absolutely no room to paint. So I thought, great, if no one else is going, I can go because there's nobody else there. So it was kind of twofold for me. I would go to the studio where I was isolated and could paint, which felt really normal at a time that was super abnormal. But it was still kind of hard with all this going on to really focus. So, and I started to notice on people's social media feeds that everybody was starting to post these selfies of themselves in their masks. And I thought, the mask is really a ubiquitous symbol of the pandemic, not just because we were wearing them to protect each other, but they became a political symbol because we had the anti-maskers that came into play. They also became representative of people's personalities because they would choose a mask often to almost like an accessory, a fashion accessory to describe who they are. So there's so many levels of the mask being representative of the pandemic that we were going through. And as a portrait artist, I thought, well, this is a nice little challenge for myself to figure out how am I going to capture a resemblance when half the face is covered. And so that was good. That was diverting. And then I decided to do most of them were 10 by 10 inch portraits, really small portraits, because I thought, because I was sort of having trouble focusing in this abnormal situation we were in, I thought, well, but I can focus on a little portrait like that. And then a couple of visits to the studio, I can have that done and be on to the next one. So as I started to, or continued to paint them, and people, again, the networking happened, the community came forward really generously, and people started sending me their selfies from all over the place. And I started painting them and thinking, this is becoming a really big series. I have, I think, about 55 of them now that I've done. And I'm not done. I'm continuing to do them as long as we're still dealing with the pandemic. And that one of these little tiny portraits doesn't have much impact, but all of these little tiny portraits together have massive impact. And that's kind of a metaphor for one person wearing a mask isn't going to do any of us any good. But if we're all protecting each other by wearing masks, then you have you have something happening. You have some impact. And so it became very metaphorical for community working together to protect each other.
I cannot wait to see that finished project come together now that I've heard it being manifested by you speaking. But I also just have a small admission, like my mask was so boring, it was black. And I'm like,
I have some of those. Send me one.
But I really am so intrigued. I can't wait to see this show come together.
Yeah, I'm going to be interested to see how many I'll end up with, because I truly am going to keep painting. And as long as people keep sending me images, it's kind of a counter endurance. It's taking a certain amount of endurance for us all to see our way through this pandemic. And so it's almost like my active endurance in my art practice that I will keep on painting these in sympathetic endurance to everybody else, what everybody else is feeling with the pandemic, until it's done. So I have no idea how many there are going to be at the end of it.
And another admission is you had recently posted one, and I won't out the artist, but you're doing really good, because I knew who it was immediately, and I was like, oh, I want, so I think that is also another interesting aspect to this, because with a lot of my staff, when they started, I only ever knew like this. And so when we were unmasked and we were unveiled, it was very alienating and very strange, because it was almost like you didn't know these people at all. So we live in very strange times. So I'm very excited to see this come together. So now I will flip to Tim. So obviously I stole these from your Instagram, Tim. So equally, and I was really, when I saw this, I was like, because we have this portrait up in your exhibition, like the older version, obviously, of Michelle Wirtz. And I was this transformation. I was like, oh, wow. Okay. So equally, you're capturing intimate portraits of various Haudenosaunee communities, which has been a keen interest of yours over the decade, something you're continuing to focus on, of course. So is there a long-term goal with this particular project? Like, are you hoping to turn it into catalogs or books? Or I mean, the work is so much. And like I said, this is just kind of an example of seeing that transition of this person that you probably documented for years and years and years, and seeing her journey. So do you have any end goals with this?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, my end goal is to finish this project one day. Um, I've always had a book or a couple books in the back of my mind. I would like to do a book just on Hutterites in general, and then maybe a book specifically focusing on Dearborn Colony, because that's the colony that I've had the relationship with the longest, and the colony that I know best. Beyond that, I plan to continue exhibiting the work as much as possible, publishing it editorially, and hopefully getting it into some archives in Canada, and I don't know that I will ever be finished the work, but I hope to. I think the next year is my last concerted push on it, like continual push. I basically lost a good portion of 2020 in terms of being able to do the work because of COVID-19. Things were so uncertain, and I couldn't risk before we had the vaccines and that. I couldn't risk inadvertently bringing COVID-19 onto a colony. So I really basically lost a year to that. So I'm hoping to make up from that, really starting in the last couple of months, and going into next year. I'm making a big push before I kind of set my sights on other projects. Not, I do think that no matter where I am in the world or not, this is something that, from time to time I'd like to come back to, especially Dearborn Colony, and check in with the community, and hopefully continue to photograph, but it will be further back on the back burner, I guess, than other projects I take on. But all in all, I just want to produce as kind of finish checking off some boxes that I feel are missing from the project or that I haven't gotten yet, following a few threads that I'm interested in, and just hopefully ending with something that I feel is as broad as I can make it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be really intrigued to see, because I mean, it's hard to explain to people the volume of work that you have with this project. Yeah. And I think to have, it would also just give such a sense of the journey with the different sitters and the different people that participated in the project, just to give a sense of, you know, because there's kind of a little bit of an investment when you go through all these photos and you're like, well, I wonder what happened to them, or I wonder where they're at now, or what their story is. You get a little bit involved. So I think that would be kind of like a natural conclusion, is almost kind of like a book, because it is in a sense a story or a tale to tell. So
absolutely, yeah, and I'm equally invested. So I love following this through over the long term, and seeing people grow within the community, and how their lives kind of change and branch out in different directions.
I think that's I'm really excited to see both of these upcoming projects, and I think there's such a lovely tide, obviously, to these exhibitions, and then moving forward with what's interesting to you now. So this kind of marks the end of our conversation, but if you happen to be in the community or the area, the shows are actually up until August 27th. And as much as it's nice that we saw them digitally, if you can come see them in real life, it's a completely different experience. And I would encourage you to please come and view them. If there's any questions, because we still have Tim and Carol with us from the participants, I would encourage that. No. I don't know if you had any, Carly.
No.
Just a voice in the dark. This is my reality, by the way. She's just like 10 feet from me, but in a different room. So, I didn't know if Tim, here's this thing too. Tim, do you have questions for Carol? Carol, do you have questions for Tim? I mean, it's, and we're open to anything at this point, or if we're questioned out, that's fine too.
Kieran just commented, would like to cheer both of these amazing creators.
Aww. I agree. Cheers. 3 cheers.
I don't have so much a question for Carol, but I will say just listening to her process and that, I find it very interesting. A lot of the similarities that I can very much relate to in terms of her relationship to the subjects, and how she approaches the subjects, even though we work in very different art forms. Anyway, I found myself nodding my head quite a bit to so much of what she was saying, and relating to her observations and her connections.
I found the same thing. Thank you, Tim. I think that there's something about portraiture, just no matter what the medium is that you're working in, that is so intriguing, and I feel that your connection with your subjects feels similar to mine, in that it's not just the interest in the visual, but it's the interest in connecting with that individual as well, around their individuality, and not them as a Hutterite, but them as that individual person. So I got that real sense from you as well.
It's really interesting to hear this come about. And like I said, this is our inaugural use of curated conversations, but it's quite lovely, because as a curator, there's a certain amount of research that you're privy to in terms of the packages and the information, but then there's also a certain amount of a guessing game as well. And so it's really lovely to see that these 2 exhibitions are really truly linked on so many different levels beyond just a most surface observation. So is there any other questions? And you didn't have anything on your end, Carly?
No, I don't.
Okay. Well, what I will do is I will actually kind of we'll stop the screen share there. And I just want to thank Tim and Carol. Thank you so much for sharing your work, your thoughts, your practices, and the whole process with us, because it gives such invaluable insight to the work. And I mean, I appreciate it. I'm sure everyone here tonight appreciates. And just thank you so much for making this work and for doing the legwork of being artists or makers. That's so important. And I just want to thank you also for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for sharing the work. That's where whatever it is that I'm trying to say as an artist with the work, it stops dead if there's no one there to interact with and to experience it. And so you sharing the work with your public, Amber, is a wonderful thing. I really appreciate it. And so nice to meet you, Tim. Thank you so much I wish I could get to Estevan to see your show live.
Yeah, no kidding.
But
Exactly. Yeah, I second everything that Carol said. And thank you, Amber, for the opportunity. And I really enjoyed this and truly appreciate it. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And with that, I'm going to end the conversation with everyone, but we will be posting this to our YouTube. So if you want to review it or pass it on or let other people know, please feel free to do so. And thanks so much again. Everyone have a lovely night.
thank you. Good night.